This sermon is by the Reverend Fiona Penny, myself, preached on the fourth Sunday of Easter at St Aidan's Parish Church, part of the Walton Team Ministry. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be pleasing in your sight, Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. I just want to pause for a moment this morning to give thanks for the vaccine in our country. We heard, I think it was on Thursday, officially that we come out of being in a pandemic situation to where the infection of COVID-19 is now endemic. And we are on the roadmap out of lockdown. And we give thanks for all those who have worked towards that vaccine, who've created it, who've delivered it, the huge infrastructure that has enabled that to happen, and we give thanks. But I also want to pray for those places around the world not so fortunate as us, and particularly for the people of India and Iraq. Our world is very different, isn't it? Holy Week this year, 2020, was better than 2021 was better than 2020 because we could actually meet. But as I reflected on the services that we were going to have, I realised so much was so very different, including, in particular, Maundy Thursday. That picture that we have at our communion service of the washing of the feet or a foot of 12 people that normally happens in the Walton team that we get from the Bible is perhaps the most explicit picture of Jesus as servant on his knees. And it made me reflect and think about what a different perspective Jesus must have had of the world from his knees. And we also hear what a very different perspective Peter had on Jesus. You're not doing that for me, Jesus. No, if you're not doing it. And if not that, then all of it. And Jesus used that different perspective to teach Peter and us. It led me to reflect on, I don't know if any of you had them, little bangles that said, what would Jesus do? And it led me to reflect that really I needed, not what Jesus do, but what's Jesus' perspective? And if any of you are at the service, you'll know that that's what I preached about. What's Jesus' perspective? So I have my imaginary WJP on my wrist. What's Jesus' perspective? So in that picture, we have Jesus' perspective as servant king. The gospel reading today gives us one of the 7 great I am sayings in the Gospel of John. I'm sure you recall them. I am the way, the truth, the light. I am the gate or the door. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the resurrection and the life. And I am the vine, as well as I am the good shepherd. Jesus invites us through this Gospel of John to see him, Jesus, in a different way. And I would suggest so that we might see the world and its problems through Jesus' eyes, his perspective. So today we're going to look at Jesus, the Good Shepherd. This week has been a very challenging one for me. Some of you know some of the issues that I've had. That has been a privilege but a challenge. One thing that I have been challenged about is the role of interim ministry, my interim ministry, being extended for up to another 3 years for the Walton Team Ministry. I had momentarily contemplated running for the hills as challenge came towards me. But this passage has helped. It's helped me stop and see what Jesus is saying to me. The hired hand runs away because the hired hand doesn't care for his sheep. The hired hand, who's not the shepherd, doesn't own the sheep and leaves and runs away. So, although I momentarily contemplated running for the hills, I came back to my calling. And my calling brings me back to the words in the ordinal, which are the words which are spoken by the bishop at the ordination of a priest. He says, or she says now, they are to set the example of the Good Shepherd always before them as a pattern of their calling. So that's me told then. No running away, young lady. And later, priests are called to be servants and shepherds among the people to whom they are sent. They must proclaim the word of the Lord and watch for the signs of God's new creation. Look, where's Jesus' perspective? What is it? So, we have from that ordinal the picture of servant and shepherd. And through our gospel, I want to look at shepherd. Interim ministry is difficult. It came about in the 1950s through the church in America. They realised that churches were decreasing in numbers of flock, of congregation. And they used something called family systems theorem and things like that to look at what is happening. And so many books have been written, but this one has been particularly helpful to me. It's called Temporary Shepherds. So it's not temporary hired hands, it's temporary shepherds. And it leads you through the process of interim. One of the challenges that we have here in the Walton Team Ministry is how on earth is one person going to be the shepherd to 3 separate flocks, particularly over these few hours on a Sunday morning. As I mentioned earlier, Bruce and I were walking in the lakes yesterday. We parked in Elterwater, walked over the top to Grasmere, had a lovely cream tea, and then we were walking the Coffin Trail. Has anyone done it? From Grasmere through to Rydal, yeah? And it's where they carried the coffins. You can imagine that as we walked on that beautiful but very hot day, I was really quite relieved that I wasn't a priest when you had to carry a coffin down the valley. So it made me smile walking the Coffin Trail. We were going Grasmere to Rydal, and just as you get to Rydal Water, there's a couple of stone seats there now, and it was just about lunchtime, so we settled down to enjoy the beautiful view of an almost still Rydal Water. Birds have stopped now. The birds singing, and it was just bliss, the warm sun, absolutely gorgeous. And then suddenly, this flock of sheep from beneath us, and there must have been about 100 of them. It was deafening, all bleating at once. Why? And then I spied a shepherd, and he'd arrived on the road from Grasmere to Rydal on his quad bike and parked up. The sheep hadn't heard his voice, as we might think of that shepherd picture 2,000 years ago and our gospel reading. They'd heard the familiar sound of the engine of his quad bike. They could differentiate it from all the cars and the lorries and the buses that were going past. They knew the sound of the quad bike engine. And as we sat there and looked, and they were so excited to be fed, these sheep and lambs, beautiful, made me think, what's Jesus' perspective on this? How do we tie the gospel for today to a man on a quad bike? We know that resources are scarce. We know they've been scarce for quite some time, both people and money. We see it from our partners in America. We see it, the shepherd on his quad bike. One man having to look after so much more land than perhaps there would have been many people. And so the shepherd in Rydal uses a quad bike. I wonder, how do we use the things that we've got to feed the sheep of this area of Walton? what's the best way of using our time, our talent, and our money. We need to see a new way, but it still needs to be God's way. I need to prepare a flock for a new type of shepherd. That's what I've been called to as temporary shepherd. Is not to model who's going to come next. They will be their own model, but to help the flock get ready for the new sheep. Jesus said to Peter, do you remember when he says, Peter, do you love me? And Peter goes, yes, I do. And he says, feed my sheep. Peter says, do you love me? He said, yes, feed me sheep. And then Peter getting quite annoyed when Jesus asks for the third time, do you love me? He says, go and feed my sheep. But it wasn't just Peter who fed the sheep. It was all the disciples. And it was Paul and the other apostles and Barnabas and Luke and everybody else. Lots of people heard the Great Commission to go and preach the good news of Jesus to the whole world. Jesus also says that we are a holy and royal priesthood. It's not just up to the person dressed like this, standing here, but up to all of us. We are all called to be shepherds of God's flock. One of the particular challenges that Di may mention later is for me being God's presence in this place, as I've mentioned. Over the last year, we've trialled some services of morning prayer once a month. Partly that is because priest resource is scarce, but it's also to model behaviour for people, for the flock, to see that you don't have to be ordained to actually lead a service or to preach. It's to encourage all of us to listen to whether God is putting that on your heart, whether you have the talent to lead, to create worship, or to preach. One of the questions that I have for this congregation is, do you want Bruce to be part of that? He's only a temporary reader here, and he's actually licensed to the cathedral, so he's in another church today. But do you want Bruce to be that person? Or do you have it within your congregation to lead and preach? Do you need us or somebody else to be part of training and walking with you? I wonder, is God speaking to you? And it's not just about leading and preaching. We're going to have the AGM soon. We need people to stand as church wardens, as sides people, as DCC, as PCC. We need people to be leaders, and there's so many ways in which you can lead. And I really encourage you to pray for that. Coming back to my role as temporary shepherd in this place for such a time as this, I do hear, well, I've heard your voice that you'd like communion every week at this service. I hope you hear mine saying, I'm trying. One of the things that I've suggested, if you want a Eucharist in this building on a Sunday when it's morning prayer, that I hold one at 8 o'clock or at 8:30. I just don't want to be on my quad bike, leaving here straight after the service when we can have coffee and whizzing off to another flock. How can we do that? The General Synod of the Church of England realises there is a reduction in resource, and they have actually passed for the first time in the whole history of the Church of England, that in recent history, that you don't have to have a communion service in a parish, because it was just making it ridiculous, particularly in those places in Devon where people have got 8, 9, 10 churches spread miles. They need a fast motorbike to get round, that you actually don't have to have a communion service in a parish. We are blessed that actually the 3 churches in this parish are fairly close together. So you could go to somewhere else, or would you like one here at a different time? Or is it that people don't like coming on a Sunday now? They feel it might be a bit busy and we need a service in the midweek. That's where my mum is. She has just moved at the beginning of lockdown, before lockdown, to Market Wheaton to sheltered accommodation, and she was shielding for most of the time. She's quite twitchy. And she was walking around the village, and she realised the church was open 3 weeks ago, and she went in, and it was a communion service, and she was quite overwhelmed. There was only 6 or 7 there, but she could be there, and she could receive the sacraments, albeit only in one kind. And she can see that for the next weeks and months, that's going to be her worship. It's not on a Sunday morning, it's on a Thursday at 10 o'clock, when she knows there's not going to be many there. Talk to me. A servant doesn't know what his master wants, her master wants, unless you tell me what is going on and what you want. My picture at Rydell Water was that the sheep, meh, meh, and they sent that signal to everybody else. They called to each other, food's here, come and get it. The last question that I want to ask you is, how do you want to be fed? And how are we going to signal to others in our congregation that there's good food on offer here at St Aidan's? Are we going to get the message out? Archbishop William Temple served as Archbishop from 1942 to 1944. How must have he been on his knees, leading the church at such a difficult time? And he wrote this: "The church exists primarily for the sake of those who are still outside it. It's a mistake to suppose that God is only, or even chiefly, concerned with religion." What a perspective. Jesus' perspective. So I leave that with you. How do you want to be fed? But how do you believe that the people of this community want to be fed? How do they want to hear the good news of Jesus? But we're looking at watches. That's another sermon for another time. Do keep talking to me, and do keep telling me, because I can't be in all 3 places at once, and I need you to be my eyes and my ears. Amen.